There was a film on TV last week called Animal Farm, and it was a cartoon version of the story written by George Orwell. I remember in my English class at school getting handed out this book we were to read, Animal Farm, and at the time I'd never heard of it, but I was pleased to see that it was a very thin book. And so I thought to myself, if I don't enjoy reading this book, at least I won't have to read too much. Now, Animal Farm is a good book, and it's an easy read. And at one level, it's about a story about some animals on a farm who decide to take over from the humans and run the farm for themselves. But you may know, on another level, it's written as a critique of totalitarian government, in particular Stalin's Russia. And of course Orwell's trick was not to mention any of that in the book, so you don't hear anything about Stalin or about Russia or any other country for that matter. Revolutions often seem like good things, and sometimes they are. But it can also be the case that the end result doesn't seem much different. It's like that old song by The Who, Won't Get Fooled Again, where Roger Daltrey sings in the last line, "Meet the new boss, same as the old boss." It can make a great deal of difference when reading something to know what the writer was trying to get across and who he or she was writing to. It's perfectly possible to read Animal Farm and just see it as a story about some animals who decide to take over their farm, and you can just read it like that. But if you know that the point that the author was trying to make behind the story, if you understand the purpose behind the book, then that adds a wee bit, an extra dimension to your reading. If I was to ask you, what do you think Matthew's purpose was when he wrote his Gospel? You might say, to tell the world the story of Jesus. But in a way that wouldn't be the right answer, or certainly not the whole answer. Matthew wasn't writing to the whole world, even though it's true that the whole world has now got his writings, and it's very good that we're able to still read them. But as I often say, nobody who wrote anything in the Bible ever thought they were writing in a book called the Bible. And when Matthew wrote his Gospel, he was writing to the church of his day, the early church. Today's story is quite a tale. It's got the very famous scene of Jesus walking on the water. Now these kind of stories always provoke the question, do you think that actually happened? Do you think that was a historical event? And of course the whole idea of walking in water, I mean that's like the punchline for all kinds of jokes, featuring ducks and clergymen and rabbis and priests sitting in boats and so on. But thinking about what literally happened is really the wrong question to ask. Because first of all, we can all have our own thoughts and opinions, but it won't be proved either way. And second, if we think that that's not a literally true story, then we either decide, well, the Bible's a lot of nonsense and just give up on the whole thing, or we need to ask ourselves, what does the story mean? Why was it included then? And third, if we accept that this was an event that took place in history, exactly as we hear it, then so what? I mean, it might be absolutely amazing. But it was an amazing thing that happened 2,000 years ago. It might have been great for the disciples to have been there and witnessed that. I'm sure that none of them would ever have forgotten it. Amazing things do sometimes happen. What's it got to do with you and me? In other words, what it all boils down to is this. What we need to do with any story in the Bible is to ask the purpose of the story. Why was that included? And what's it trying to say? Matthew wrote his Gospel for the church community. But the time that he wrote it and the reason why he wrote it is now fairly well known. It's fairly well understood. the background to his writing was a time of high drama. The very first Christians were Jews, as of course was Jesus himself. And so they still thought of themselves as Jews, that they continued to worship with their fellow Jews. And Christianity was not a distinct religion on its own. But then that changed. There was an attack on the Jerusalem temple. The Romans started a new wave of persecution. And the Jews decided, as they often did in ancient times, that if they were suffering, it must mean that God is in some way angry with them, for some reason. And so they began to think about how that could be. Maybe they weren't being devout enough. And they looked for somebody somewhere to blame. And then they decided it should be these Jews with their weird views about Jesus. They're obviously not true Jews. So as a result, the followers of the Christ were expelled from the synagogues and the other worship gatherings. They were basically kicked out of the family. So the Christians found themselves on their own. But it got worse. They were living under the Roman Empire. And the Romans would do certain things to reduce resistance to what they were doing. And so one of the things the Romans did was they tolerated certain official religions. As long as people obeyed the commands of Caesar and obeyed the commands of Rome, then they could continue to worship their own gods in their own way. So there was a certain protection given to Jews. But that understanding and protection didn't cover this new strange group of people who had faith in the Jesus guy. So the followers of Jesus found themselves in a really frightening position. They were now locked out of the Jewish community from their places of worship. They were rejected by their old community, and they were now seen as being a weird, illegitimate group by the occupying power. And being seen as different from the people all around you, it's not long before persecution will begin. And the Christians, as they became known, started getting blamed for everything that went wrong. It could be mortally dangerous to profess your faith in Jesus Christ. And so for the very first time, the church became very vulnerable and eventually found they were under attack. So storms had come their way. Things were not looking good. It was really worrying. And this was what was happening when Matthew wrote his gospel. And he wrote it to remind them all of what Jesus had done for them. For those who were still able to remember being with Jesus, and for those who were too young to have been alive at the time when Jesus was there with them. He wrote it so folk would have a record that they were able to hold on to of the things that Jesus said and the things that he taught and the things that he did. He wrote it so they would remember what happened at Easter. He wrote it to remind them that God was at work in Jesus and that Jesus was like a gift to humanity from God. And he wrote it to encourage them in their faith. Now, when persecution began around the known world, the Christians found themselves having to go underground, sometimes even literally underground. They had to meet in secret locations, and in the early days they developed a kind of secret signs and words that they used to communicate with one another. One was the Greek word ichthus, which is an acronym of the words Jesus Christ, Son of God, Saviour. And the word ichthus was the word for fish. So a fish became the emblem or a symbol for Christianity in the church, and we still see it today. And there was another one, and this was the boat. The church saw itself as a ship, usually a small boat out on stormy waters, navigating the mighty ocean. And that symbol also has been with the church throughout history. Even today, the World Council of Churches has a sign of the church as a wee boat. So, just as a story can work at more than one level, so this story from Matthew is doing the same thing. When Matthew talks about the friends of Jesus in the boat, he's thinking of getting a current message, or a message to the current friends of Jesus in their boat. Of course, he may also be referring to an event that took place years before involving Jesus and the first disciples. But Matthew's main aim is to say something to those who are going to read his words. And he wants to say to the people in the wee boat of the church, adrift in hostile weather, with opposition and with storms to face, that despite everything, they can take heart. Because whatever they have to face, they will never have to face it alone. In the story, there were 3 problems for the people aboard the ship. There was a huge storm, and so waves were coming into the boat. And then the wind was driving them off course. And then they were far out in the lake. In other words, they were far from shore. And that combination of factors was what made things so dangerous. And even the very experienced fishermen on board, the experienced sailors, were struggling to cope with that. And so Jesus does for them what they can't do for themselves. Now, today we are the church, and we are in the wee boat of the church. And on Sundays we're mostly communicating through Zoom, which sounds like the name of a nippy wee speedboat. But it might be that we don't feel that the church is a speedboat. We're a church which, like everybody else I guess, doesn't even know how events are going to unfold in the next few months. We're a church that's got a lot of organising to do. We're a church that's getting ready to open to what might be a maximum of only 25 people. We're a church that faces big challenges and changes in how we're going to operate and communicate. And we're a church in which, in the eyes of many, which is no longer needed. We're a church that's sidelined by society. We're a church which is ridiculed by the new atheists on the outside and made ridiculous by some of the antics and comments from crazy people within our own ranks. So you don't need to think very hard to see that the church today is a wee bit like a wee boat on a hostile, stormy sea. It doesn't look promising. The storms threaten our staying afloat, and we can't walk on water. But Jesus can. And he comes to help us and give us the resources to do what we can't do on our own. Jesus came into this world to show us God. Remember that song that Joan Osborne sang a few years back? What if God was one of us? Well, God was one of us. Jesus came to show us God in human form. Jesus does the things that God does. And God still comes to us. We still encounter God. And in the most dangerous, most dodgy, most worrying times for us, God comes near. When the storms come, so does Jesus. We look to an uncertain future, and we may be fearful or even despondent, but we're not alone. Faith is not having a stiff upper lip and boasting about how we can cope with the storms that are attacking our boat. It's not saying that we are stronger and more powerful than all the problems around us in the world. That's bravado, but it's not faith. Faith is realising that God is with us, and that when we face troubling times that seem beyond us, there is one who has called us to be in this boat in the first place, who will actually come to us in the storms and guide us safely to shore. Amen.